Hello, I'm Amy Baldwin, and I'm here with Lori Hazard, and we're going to talk about roommate issues. When I think about this topic, it's something that all students who live with someone struggles with at some point, and nobody ever really gives them, I think, a lot of advice. It's usually like communicate, don't be a jerk, or
Yeah,
something like that. But other than that, there's not a lot said, or we just assume that, if they had siblings, they know how to, treat each other. So talk to me a little bit about what are some of the big things that happen that knowing ahead of time that they might happen, it can be helpful to kind of work through.
yeah. I mean, I think if you think about it, there are no places where people have forced roommate situations except for, prison and the military.
I was gonna say prison.
Prison and the military, right?
Yeah.
So, and a lot of our students do come from homes where they haven't had to share rooms with siblings, so
Mhm.
they haven't had to negotiate appropriate boundaries and let's face it, a pretty small space for the most part, right? And
Right.
some colleges and universities have forced triples, so you could be negotiating with a third person.
Right.
So I mean, I think what happens is the extent to which students are neat is a huge issue. Um, Noise level is another huge issue. Inviting people from other rooms into your room is another issue.
Mhm.
What time everyone's going to bed, if people aren't going to bed at the same time. So those are the four sort of biggies that come to mind for me, and patterns that I've seen with students trying to negotiate um, living with someone else. When my son went off to college, his roommate got a girlfriend pretty quickly, and he had to negotiate space in the room regarding with the girlfriend being over, which wasn't easy as a first year student.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and even if they're just hanging out, sometimes if there's some incompatibility, you know, you may be getting along great with the roommate, but the roommate's significant other or the roommate's friend, you don't love so much. And then now they're always in that space, and now that space is not your own. I have students who find living with what they call they call it a stranger is
yeah,
is very you know, um, challenging for them. And you mentioned, a lot of times, um, young people these days, I sound like an old person saying that, or haven't necessarily grown up sharing a room. They also probably haven't grown up sharing a bathroom, which some
right.
of them
Yeah.
talk about, having to negotiate just how long is that shower going to be? And did you get toothpaste all over the sink and that kind of stuff? So what are some key things that parents need to know that could help their student deal with some of these things?
Yeah. What I think is great, and a lot of colleges and universities do this, they have roommate contracts
Mhm.
that they give to the students when they're moving in the first few weeks of them living in the residence hall. Um, it's wonderful, but as we all know, there's a honeymoon stage when it comes to any new experience. And so if you think of that idea of culture shock and the honeymoon stage, a lot of times the roommate contract is being delivered while the students are still in that exciting honeymoon stage of getting to know their roommate and we're living together. And then the conflicts don't arise until week 3 or 4. So
Right.
it's a good idea if your student is calling you and saying, I'm having difficulty with my roommate, to see if you can get them back to thinking about, was there a roommate contract? If so, what were the agreements that were made on the roommate contract, and to kind of revisit. I also think there's a really good conflict resolution strategy that works in a wide variety of situations. And you say, I feel blank when you blank. So I feel nervous when you're up until 2 o'clock in the morning and I have my 8 o'clock class. I feel like I'm not going to be able to get enough sleep. So
Mhm.
instead of saying, you're such a jerk, you kept me up until 2 o'clock in the morning, you can use those I statements and say, I feel a little bit uneasy when you have 3 or 4 people in the room and it's getting really loud and you're drinking, and I know that there's a rule against that on this campus. It makes me feel nervous. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if we can talk about how to figure out working this out. So that I statement conflict resolution skill, I think, is really helpful. And an RA or RD can help students navigate through that. But I think coming up with norms of how you want to work things out in the room, like, do we make an 11 o'clock lights out rule? Do we make a everybody has to pick up their clothes and there can't be dirty underwear on the floor? So you come up with sort of your rules of the room with your roommate, if there isn't a roommate contract that gets at some of that kind of stuff.
I love the conflict resolution, like coaching model that you just shared, because I think that's really hard for people to articulate why they're mad, or why they're upset or irritated. Sometimes I will talk to students and they're not even sure why, they just know they're irritated. So that's a great way to get them to start thinking about why they're feeling the way they are and what they need from that. But, there's another piece of it that I try to teach, try to teach my kids, and then I'm trying to be mindful of it whenever I'm rooming with somebody or on a work trip or vacation or whatever, which is I try to be the best version of myself. So I'm a little quieter, just being more mindful of my actions and their impact. So how long, trying to be quick in the bathroom if I don't need to be in there for a long time, if I'm, staring at my face for 30 minutes, perhaps, just being mindful that somebody else may want to be in there. And then, being mindful of being very quiet in the morning. So if my roommate is still asleep and I have an early morning class, just, moving somewhere if I need to make some noise, like out, instead of just kind of, banging around and not being very particularly, mindful of the noise that I'm making. So.
Yeah, and I think you're right. At the beginning, there's no harm in saying, hey, I'm going to go use the bathroom. I'm probably going to be there in about 20 minutes. Do you need anything before I go?
Right.
Or, hey, I'm planning on doing my laundry tomorrow afternoon and I'm going to want to be putting it away. Are you going to be around in the afternoon? Just kind of in that constant negotiation, right? And overdoing it at the beginning until you get used to each other.
Absolutely. And you never know, you can end up being friends. I'm still friends with if she's watching this, because she likes to watch some of the stuff that I put on LinkedIn, I'm still friends with my college roommate. We were together for years. She could probably tell stories about me, which I'm gonna ask her not to do, not to post underneath this video. But yeah, there could be some lifelong friendships forged, but also it's okay if they're not, right? It's okay if it's just a living arrangement and you go do your thing and they do their thing. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's important to tell students, because there are those sort of, mythologies about, I'm going to have this roommate and we're going to become best friends and we're going to be lifelong friends. And when that expectancy is violated, students can get disappointed. And I think it's important to say, on the other side of the coin, you might just have a living arrangement with your roommate, and you just need to get along well enough to live together and have respect for each other, but you don't have to be best friends.
Right. And I want to, before we wrap this up, I want to just go back to something you said, and you talked about an RA or an RD. Define those really quickly for those that don't know that term.
Yeah, so I know some schools call them community directors or a resident director. Which is usually a professional staff member who has responsibility for sort of overseeing the relationships in the residence halls and the running of the residence halls. And they are usually the supervisor of a resident assistant who is a student who's trained in conflict resolution skills and some paraprofessional counseling skills to help students if they're having different sorts of issues around adjusting to college. An RA usually is a student who lives on the floor or in the suite. And the students usually know who they are and can go to them if they have any issues. And if the RA is unsuccessful resolving some of the issues, the student can go to the resident director.
Yeah, RA for resident assistant is usually. And, I remember the RA in one of my buildings one year, I think there was somebody whose alarm, that when they would leave for the weekend, their alarm was still set. This was back in the day, when you had just one alarm clock, you didn't have a phone, and that was also alarm clock. And it was set for 7:30 or whatever, and it would go off on a Saturday. And that person just had no idea that it was disturbing because they weren't there. So I remember going to the RA saying, hey, so-and-so and, next door is not turning off their alarm when they leave for the weekend. Could you remind them, or could we figure out to work through that? And it was that was an example of, they didn't realize they were being annoying. 'cause they
Right,
weren't there.
yes.
But they weren't necessarily being mindful of, the impact of some of their, choices. And so the RA really helped negotiate that and, make sure that we got a resolution. So,
And I think a lot of times the onus is on the student, right, to disclose what's going on if they're having issues, to let the RA know. But in recent years, RAs have been trained to be a little bit more mindful and intrusive, where they'll have check-ins with students as a routine, or routine hall meetings, or they created services and programs to make sure that they're kind of checking in on all of their residents and making sure that they're doing okay, especially during that first year.
yeah. So good to coach your student on knowing who those people are, going to them whenever it's something they can't resolve, and then also
Yeah.
just working hard to resolve it
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah, and attending those hall meetings and attending the programs that are put in place in the residence hall, so that they can learn about, if they do come across one of the conflicts that we talked about, they'll have more information about how to easily resolve it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Lori.